Good evening, I'm Merlin Tuttle, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about bat caves, how to find them, how to protect them, and how to restore them. We'll emphasize caves in America quite a bit, but for our international listeners, I want you to feel very welcome to ask questions that are specific to your areas. I guess the first question is, why should it be a problem to even find bat caves to protect? Isn't it obvious? There are bats living there.
Oh.
Oh. I'm sorry, that just blew it.
Hi.
Had an unexpected visitor. I'll go on now. Back to the bat caves. Why is it so important? Now, just a minute. Let's start over again. I'm Merlin Tuttle, and tonight we're going to talk about how to find, protect, and restore bat caves. Isn't it kind of obvious which caves need to be protected? I mean, aren't those the ones that have the bats in them? The truth is that long before our arrival on this planet, a large proportion of the world's bats had already disappeared. From the time that humans first arrived, we have been competing with bats for caves. There are lots of caves, more than either us or bats use, but the caves that are really good for bats and that are best for us are the same caves. So even though they're a small proportion, we've been competing with bats for a long time, not only competing with them, but in much of the world we actually ate the bats. And so many of the world's bat caves have lost their bats long ago, and sometimes perhaps 1,000 years ago or more. Many of our bat caves in America lost their bats more than 100 years ago, and nobody has seen more than perhaps a dozen or even fewer bats in recorded history. But some of these caves that have lost their bats are the very ones that need to be protected. Many of the bats we see today are living in sites that are definitely not meeting their needs. They are barely surviving in these sites. And it isn't going to do a lot of good to protect sites where bats are barely surviving. So let's talk a little bit about what bats need. As we start in equatorial areas and go north and south, until we get to about 25 degrees, we've got subtropical or tropical climates. And since cave temperatures usually approximate the average annual surface temperature, caves in this area are going to be fairly warm, too warm unless they're at high elevation for bats to hibernate in them. But they'll be great for bats to use year-round for things like rearing young. As we get further north and south away from the equatorial area, in the, let's say, 35 to 40 degree latitude range, we come into an area where bats are highly dependent upon certain rare caves that trap warm or cold air. They can't use most of the caves in those areas. If we go far enough north and south away from the equator, we get into zones where the weather is so cold and the caves are cold enough that unless they freeze, they're actually great for harboring hibernating bats. Here in America, most of our caves are in the middle area where they have to be very good cold or warm air traps in order to house bats at any time of year in any significant numbers. Since most of our bats were lost before we were even born, we can't today just go looking for which ones have bats when we want to really restore bat populations. But restoring bat populations in caves is really important. Our caves once housed by far the biggest populations of bats anywhere. And if we don't restore the right caves, we'll never have a chance to restore the numbers of bats that our ecosystems evolved to depend upon. Now, with that introduction, I'm very happy to begin entertaining questions. There are certainly many things to talk about.
So yeah, ask your questions anytime. You'll see them pop up here. But for now, the floor is yours, Merlin.
Okay, no questions yet. Let's talk about what it takes in a mid-latitude area in America, let's say from North Alabama up through South Indiana, to be a good hibernation cave. To be a good hibernation cave in this area, we've got to have a good cold air trap. And how we get a good cold air trap is we have to have a cave with multiple entrances at different altitudes. Just even 100 feet difference or even less can be all it takes to make a cold air trap. And once we have the conditions, then we have to have a large volume in the cave that is lower than the lowest entrance. And in the wintertime, we get airflow that we call chimney effect airflow because it's just like what happens in your chimney at home. In your chimney at home, hot air goes up and out and draws in cooler air at the bottom. That's what happens in caves in the wintertime because the walls relative to outside temperature are warming the air, and as the air is warmed, it rises through the upper entrance, creates sometimes a literal vacuum at a lower entrance, and it allows heavier cold air to come settling in. And then if there are lower areas below the lowest entrance in the cave, those will trap large volumes of cold air, hopefully. And that's exactly what the bats need, because when they come to hibernate, many of them enter in September or October, way before the fall weather gets really cold, and they need low temperatures to keep their metabolism down before actual winter starts. So they need these cold air traps.
Do you have any good stories about those traps?
Well, the first cold air trap I ever found was one of my luckiest and almost ended my career. In my book, The Secret Lives of Bats, I described that experience where I found an extraordinarily large bat population in a great cold air trap, but one that almost trapped me. I have certainly had some rather interesting experiences trying to find cold air traps and warm air traps in caves. They're not all obvious. Sometimes we have to go deep into a cave to find exactly what we're looking for. Certainly in the case of bats, they've often been disturbed into leaving the entry areas where they should be and moving into inner areas.
How did it almost end your career? What's the story?
The story is that I had just discovered that my banded gray bats were going to a cave that I didn't yet realize the importance of. My parents went there with me to help me look for banded bats. I left them in a part of the cave that was fairly remote while I climbed down a narrow passage to look for bats, and eventually I almost ended my life in that passage. It got so tight that I was practically breaking my ribs getting through. But I came out finally into a room on the other side, a big room, and forgot that I needed to go tell my parents that I'd gotten out before I did anything else. The reason I forgot was I looked up and got really excited seeing a large number of bats streaming in and out of what looked like a solid wall 60 feet above me. Well, I knew bats don't go in and out of solid walls, so I started climbing up to see what was up there, and sure enough, there was an entry to an inner cave that nobody had ever discovered yet, and the bats were using that to escape human disturbance. I ended up braced between two walls something like 70 feet above the cave floor, following bats. finally ended up having to literally go hand over hand across a wide area where I couldn't span it. Ended up dropping down into a small room that was housing literally over 100,000 bats. It was a young bat biologist gold mine. I got so excited I didn't even pay attention to how I was going to climb back out of the room and forgot about time. And as I was reading band numbers and writing them down in a side passage, my light suddenly went out. And at first I assumed that if the light went out that it must have just been bumped by a bat. But I remembered too that it ran out of, these are way back in the days of carbide lights. You had to have rocks of carbide in the bottom of your light and water at the top, and you'd let the water trickle down into the carbide to turn it into acetylene gas, and you'd light that with a reflector for a light. Well, I thought, well, maybe I run out of water when it didn't start right away. So I spit in it, and it finally started again. I thought, oh, well, bat must have knocked it out after all. No problem. I'm going to go ahead and go back and record some more numbers. Well, that was a near fatal mistake because it really was out of water and it ran out of spit pretty quick. And the next thing I knew is I was sitting there without any light at all. I finally got just a tiny 2-millimeter nub of a light to come out of it, flame. And when that happened, I decided to try to get out, even though it was the scariest thing in my life. I had to literally hang 70 feet above the floor and go hand over hand, barely able to see anything. But finally did get out far enough to hear my father calling for me in the distance. And we came to a place where he could hand carbide and water to me, but I still couldn't get out, and I had to go back and retrace my steps before I could ever find my way back out. It was a very scary way to start a career, but it led to finding one of the best cold air trap hibernation sites in America.
Wow. Merlin, we have a question. Do you think that most caves in New York State are now untouchable for bats due to WNS? Our numbers are so low, it's very discouraging. I've been searching for and monitoring maternity colonies in western New York, again finding much lower numbers than previous. I'm quite discouraged by what I'm finding this year especially.
The answer is no, WNS hasn't made these caves uninhabitable. What's going to happen, and there's good evidence that it's already happening, is even though millions of bats have died, many in that area, there are survivors with genetic resistance, and those are beginning to rebuild populations. And as they rebuild, they don't have a problem living in a cave that's infected with the fungus that causes white nose syndrome because they're resistant. And so I don't think that the fact that caves in New York or elsewhere are infected with white nose syndrome is going to be a problem into the long-term future as bats with genetic resistance begin to rebuild. This is what appears to have happened in Europe and Asia, where bats are resistant to white nose syndrome. They probably at one time had a big problem just like ours, and many died, and the survivors were resistant. Another question?
That's awesome. No, but do you want to talk about maybe, I don't know if it's jumping ahead too much, but to what cavers can do to help protect?
Yeah, you know, when it comes to finding good bat caves, we often think we know where they all are. The truth is we often don't. When a bat biologist or a conservationist wants to see bats, we inquire around as to where the bats are, and people tell us, yeah, there's a cave over so-and-so that has bats or used to have bats, and we go over there to look. But nobody tells us about the sites that nobody's ever seen a bat in. In fact, I had one of these experiences a number of years ago in Kentucky. I went to investigate a cave that had been declared critical habitat for endangered Indiana bats. And I no more than got in, and I was looking around saying, this can't be a really important hibernation site. It's just not right. It doesn't have a good enough cold air trap. It won't have cold enough air at the right time. It won't be stable enough. The bats are going to have to wake up too many times and exhaust energy before spring. And so I was very curious as to why the bats were there and where they might have come from. Well, on the way out, as we were literally going back to our vehicle to leave, I noticed a park sign that said, if you come to the commercial cave, be sure and bring your coat. Or actually, I think it was called the tour cave. Be sure and bring your coat. It's cold year-round. And the moment I saw that sign, I said, please, can somebody take me to that cave? We went in, and behind, much of it was hidden behind the smoke from old torches from guano miners from the War of 1812 that took nitrates out of the cave to make gunpowder. We were able to find extensive stains on the limestone left by hibernating bats. We estimated more than 100,000. And so just by pointing out to the park that they would terminate winter tours of people in the cave and perhaps do a few things to restore the right air currents, because tour caves have often been altered tremendously, as have those that have been mined for nitrates. New entrances opened, old entrances closed, passages changed, but they did close off the cave to winter tours, and they did begin doing things to help restore the proper temperatures. And almost immediately we started getting geometric growth of Indiana bat population as the bats gradually figured out that here our old place is good again and started moving back to where they should be. And this is very often a case throughout temperate zones of the world.
Jade says, and came about Saltpeter Cave. I assisted in the gate construction, and I was a cave guide there at the time.
I think you got the right place. Yes, Saltpeter Cave was where the bats went where they shouldn't have been after they got knocked out of the, let's see, Saltpeter Cave, Saltpeter Cave was where they should have been, the tour cave, and I don't remember the name of the alternative, maybe it was Bat Cave, but you've got the right place in mind, and I would love to talk to somebody that knew what's happening now, because I've lost touch with it in recent years.
Awesome. What else, Merlin?
This cave that we just talked about in Kentucky is just one of many examples I could mention. If you look at our new resource page on how to find, protect, and restore bat caves, you'll find a whole lot more information on detection of old caves that are no longer used, how to restore them, and how to protect them. But in that resource, I have used a couple of cave examples, one of them showing exactly what I mean about potentially protecting the wrong place. Another cave that was considered critical habitat for endangered Indiana bats was called Bat Cave in Missouri. And this cave had huge dimensions, a great big entrance and great big entrance passage, and for decades at a time it would trap just almost exactly the right amount of cold air to enable Indiana bats to hibernate in it. Unfortunately, what nobody planned for when it was protected was that if you look at climatological data, you can figure that at least once every 50 to 100 years there's going to be a very serious cold front come through that would wipe out all those bats. And that's exactly what happened. The bats were protected for decades. Population was growing, we were doing great, reestablishing endangered species. Then all of a sudden one winter, big cold front comes through, the bats, almost every one of them, froze to death. And I've had other experiences with different kinds of caves. For example, I was involved in getting a cave protected in Florida that's also talked about in our resource. The Sneed's Cave in North Florida was in a relatively low area, but not one that we ever imagined would flood. Most of the caves in higher terrain in Florida are long lost to bats because they're the top valued real estate for people to build homes on. Anyway, we got this cave protected, and over about a 20-year period, we were so proud that we actually managed to reestablish 250,000 bats in this cave. Unfortunately, about that time, a rare big hurricane came along and drowned almost every one of those bats. We had inadvertently created a death trap. That's another reason why it pays to know something about bat caves and their needs, so that we don't protect places where they are just holding on, barely surviving, when we should be, if not protecting ideal places, maybe then creating artificial ones, but at least not luring them into places where they shouldn't be just because there are already some there and we think that might be a good place.
Is that one of the stories you referred to in the resource page?
Yes, that is one of the stories referred to in the new resource page.
Great.
So let's talk about what an ideal bat cave would be like.
Yeah.
An ideal bat cave in the temperate zone of the world, particularly in Middle America, would be a cave that would have a cold air trap and a warm air trap, all in one cave. That would enable one colony of bats to rear young in the warm air trap and move just to another part of the cave in wintertime to hibernate in a cold air trap. And we do in fact have a few of those caves in the U.S., but they're very few and far between, and they're incredibly valuable to bats when they exist. How you get these is, let's just envision, and you can see actual figures and diagrams of what I'm talking about if you go to my resource page, but let's just envision a long sloping tunnel through a mountainside. There's an entrance up a few hundred feet or 1,000 feet up here, and then down at the low end there's another entrance. And what you're going to get is, on cold winter days, the air warmed inside is going to start flowing out the upper entrance because it's lighter than the outside air. And as it does that, if there's enough area doing that, it can actually create a vacuum that pulls heavy cold air uphill into the lower entrance. And if you have an area not far in the lower entrance that dips down like a bowl where you can trap cold air, that can be, if it's big enough, a great hibernation site for bats. And similarly, if near the upper end of this long tube you have a raised area where warm air can be trapped in summer, then you've got the perfect bat cave where they can live there year round. And in fact, what happens then in the summer is the air is cooled relative to the outside, and it is heavy then and flows out the lower entrance, and this draws warm air into the upper entrance. And if you have an area, bowl-shaped area above the passage a little ways in, warm air will go up and get trapped there, and that's where you'd find bats in the summer. Bats rarely find a cave that has all this in one site. But overall, if you're looking for the best bat caves of the past, you're looking for the biggest caves, the ones that are probably today most popular for humans. In fact,
okay.
the biggest cave of all time, Mammoth Cave, or the biggest cave in North America, was also, without any doubt, the biggest shelter for bats in all of North America and maybe in the world. There were millions, probably tens of millions of bats in this cave at one time. It was huge. It had big rooms, big passages, multiple entrances so that warm air could go out the upper chimney entrances in the winter. Cold air could come down through the lower ones, get trapped in large volumes below. And so it was a perfectly stable, great site with already cool temperatures when the bats most needed them, when they would first get there from migration. And it's probable that bats came from literally almost the entire eastern United States to hibernate there. The first reports from Mammoth Cave indicate that there were, well, the claim was that there were literally miles of passages that were solidly covered by great masses of bats in the wintertime. Now, we know about news media, and they're bad enough sometimes today, so do we really trust a story that says that miles of passages were covered solidly with bats more than 100 years ago? Well, yes, because eventually, even after probably most of the bats had been extirpated by human use and alteration of Mammoth Cave, a well-known and respected biologist from Princeton University was asked to come down and check and see if all these bats really were there. He reported in his later published report that, well, I didn't go in very far, but I went in far enough to see that, yeah, there are at least millions of bats in there, and I sent a sample to the Smithsonian. So, of course, later I went to the Smithsonian to see those bats, and they were endangered, largely endangered Indiana bats, but a variety of other species as well. So we went back then, and a group of us looked for stains on walls, and when we measured the stained evidence on the limestone, we didn't even go through more than a tiny fraction of Mammoth Cave, and we estimated that less than half of the area we saw stained had bats in it originally. We were conservatively estimating, just as conservative as it's possible to be, and we still came up with just this one area that we checked having had probably around 10 million bats in it. Now you might be wondering about stains. Well, if you go to my resource on this subject, you'll find photographs showing bat stains. Limestone is easily stained by roosting bats. They etch it out with their feet. The CO2 from their breath eats into the limestone. Their little claws eat into the limestone. Then oily, you notice if humans are going through a door real often, and instead of closing it by the doorknob, we do it with our hand, you'll see it start to turn brown in an area. That's from oils off our hands getting on the door. Well, the same thing happens in a roost where bats live for a long time in a cave. And if you look at my illustrations in my resource, you'll quickly see that it's pretty easy to detect the difference between bat-made stains and natural mineral stains. Natural mineral stains, the mineral is oozing out from within the rock, and the deepest recesses in the rock, in the limestone, are the darkest stained, because that's where the stain's coming from. When it's bat stains, it's just the opposite. It's the outermost parts of the wall that are most stained and the innermost least stained, because the bat fur isn't rubbing on the innermost parts nearly as much. Stains can vary a lot from region to region with different kinds of limestone and bats, but it's very recognizable. And by measuring those stains from the past and multiplying times average roosting density of bats, and that varies depending on where you are, but in most places in the United States, it would be reasonable to probably very conservative to say that bats are roosting at about 200 per square foot. If you just multiply 200 per square foot times the area of staining, you can get a rough estimate of just how many bats were there in the past. And some of these places will just boggle our minds. I have been in caves where the walls and ceiling were solidly stained with obvious bat stains for a full kilometer. That would mean tens of millions of bats in the past. So by checking for these stains and getting an idea from the amount of area they covered and where they are, we can get a very good idea of how important it might be to restore and protect a given cave that's lost its bats. Stains that are on vertical walls tend to be made by hibernating bats, and ones that are in domed ceilings where heat is trapped up in the dome, those tend to be made by nursery colonies of bats.
Jade asked, as far as artificial caves, I don't know if you had any more stain stuff to cover.
No.
Okay. As far as artificial caves, have any man-made structures, coal mines, etc., been conducive to many species as a significant hibernacula?
Repeat that once.
It's right here.
Okay, as far as artificial caves, have any man-made structures, coal mines, etc., been conducive to many species as a significant hibernation site? Absolutely. That's one thing that I'm very happy you mentioned. I should have myself. Many of the largest remaining bat populations in America and perhaps in the world are found in abandoned mines dug by humans. In the Great Lakes region of the U.S., for example, the average surface temperature is almost exactly what many bats need for ideal hibernation temperatures. Because of that, these old mines have ideal temperatures without having to trap cold or warm air. They're just perfect right when the bats first get there, and then they're perfect all the way through till spring, because they don't need to change any. They don't need to breathe or anything. They're just the right temperature because they approximate the surface average temperature, which is what the bats need to hibernate in. And many bats, millions of bats that have lost their original homes in caves have eventually found homes in old mines. And one of the things I'm very proud of is the fact that I was able to lead efforts years ago to gain protection for most of the biggest old mines in the Great Lakes region, which include literally hundreds of miles of passages accessible to bats. And we believe we can't check all those hundreds of miles. It'd be too dangerous these days, but almost certainly we're protecting literally millions of bats in those. So mines can be really great alternative places for bats to roost. In fact, a mine that we protected in collaboration with the Uniman Company years ago, the Magazine Mine in southern Illinois, we protected it when the mining company finished mining before bats arrived. The company called us and offered it as a possible bat habitat. Based on the temperatures we found in the mine, we knew that it could be ideal for hibernating Indiana bats. We raised $250,000 to get it protected. A whole group of partners, Bat Conservation International, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, the state, all pitched in. But we invested a lot of money based on the assumption that this was good habitat. And in fact, we can predict such things, as illustrated at this magazine mine, because within the next 15 years, it had the largest, fastest growing population of endangered Indiana bats in America, more than 40,000. And the last big find for endangered Indiana bats was in fact in another mine. So mines can be really important. And one thing we need to be really careful of, sometimes communities will get upset because somebody got injured in an old mine and want to quickly close one. It's possible that when we close a mine for good, what we think are good safety reasons, we may be burying hundreds of thousands of bats that'll have no escape and lose their not only lose their habitat but be killed on the in the closure. So we need to be very careful about protecting old mines. They have huge potential for helping bats that are now otherwise homeless, but they can't meet all the bats' needs. There are still bats in America that are inadequately having their needs met, and in fact that's why the endangered Indiana bat is still endangered. It was probably the biggest primary user of Mammoth Cave and Wyandotte, Mammoth Cave in Kentucky and Wyandotte Cave in Indiana, and had it not been for loss of these two caves that became tour caves, this species would probably never have become endangered. But until at least parts of those caves are restored or alternatives are provided, that species will stay endangered. We're just not meeting its needs adequately. But the good news is that there are things that we could do at both those caves to restore the bats. In fact, I've been very frustrated that for more than 15 years I've been trying to get something done at Wyandotte Cave in southern Illinois, and southern Indiana, I'm sorry. All it would take to restore the kind of temperature that bats, Indiana bats, need there to really regrow a big population is a few $1,000s worth of expenses to build a wall and some air blocking doors at the entrance. What happened, and I have pictures in our resource article that show you what happened. A picture from 1914 shows the cave's original entrance. And then we also show you how it was dug down to open it for tourism, and when that happened it was like cutting a slit in a dam. The water would all run out. Well, the cold air ran out too, and every time a cubic meter of cold air ran out, a cubic meter of warm air was drawn in to an upper entrance. It raised the temperature of the cave and made it largely marginally suitable for this endangered species. It would not be that difficult to fix that problem, and there are other problems like it that we're probably not even aware of yet that, if fixed, could result in huge progress. And how do I know that? Because during my career I've been involved in at least a half a dozen places where we restored huge populations by simply either protecting a site or protecting and restoring the conditions needed by bats. In fact, the endangered gray bat was in such trouble when I began studying them for my doctoral thesis many years ago that America's leading authorities had predicted that it would soon become extinct. Yet today, thanks to help from countless cavers who have volunteered their services, helping design the ultimate caver-proof gates that were great for bats, and not only designing them but building them for us, we today have millions more gray bats than when their extinction was predicted.
Lee just joined. So did Johnny.
Hi, Lee. And I see Johnny Stabler has joined.
Yep.
Johnny's late husband, Fred, was one of my all-time favorite allies in game protection for key mines all across North America. He had huge influence through his position at the Bureau of Land Management, and together we created enormous progress which will long outlive either one of us, and I would certainly like to make sure that his name is not forgotten as a key in the history of American bat conservation.
That's awesome. Wildlife Integration says fascinating stuff. Thank you, Merlin. Hi, Steve. Jay also says, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's Jay or Jade, if that's just Facebook name. He also says, I remember installing the plywood door in Saltpeter Cave at Carter Caves. I was very surprised at the difference that such a simple addition made in the attractiveness of the cave to bats.
Yeah, let me add to that. I have some really good examples of how that can work. At Bellamy Cave in Tennessee, which is now, I'm delighted to report, protected by the, I know the Nature Conservancy acquired and originally protected. I think it's now probably owned by the state. But this site is a place that I visited a long time ago, more than 30 years ago. And I found evidence based on staining and cave contours that it used to house a huge population of endangered gray bats. I just, in leaving, had a little talk with the owner who'd given me permission to go in, and told him how sad it was that this used to be a huge bat cave, but through human vandalism and disturbance over the years, it had lost all but 65 of its bats. I had no idea that he was actually going to act on anything that I told him, and I didn't hear anything more about it until, it was 20 or 30 years later that I got a call from a colleague's mother saying, you know, small world, but a friend of mine just bought the property where they call it Bellamy Caves on that property, and she says there's a huge number of bats in. They'd like to know what to do for the bats. We went and took a look, and now there's, I don't know the current number, but it's like 200,000. And what was really interesting was when I'd first gone there, one of the things that was wrong wasn't just the disturbance. We got the disturbance taken care of, and I'd forgotten one other detail. When we came back a couple years later, the population had gone down even more, but that was because the man that owned the cave had a water pump in the cave. He was pumping water for his house, and he had trouble with the water pipes freezing in the winter, so he just put up a piece of plywood in the entrance to block some of the cold air so that his water pipes wouldn't freeze, and that had made all the difference for the bats. We almost lost every single bat, but I tactfully explained to him that despite his other efforts, unfortunately his protection of his water pipe was devastating the remaining bats. And so he simply insulated his pipe, took the plywood out, and it was after that that we got the huge recovery of bats. So just amazingly simple things can make a huge difference if we're just alert to what bats need and address those needs.
Shireen says, I wish there were more advocates for animal rights like you. We might have more innocent critters alive.
Well, we probably would, but it's not all done by me. I have led the way in saving millions of bats at probably thousands of locations worldwide, but it was not done alone. It was done because a lot of people like you supported my work, and I couldn't be more grateful. In the world of bats, couldn't be more grateful. You've done a wonderful thing, not just for bats, but for people. Every time we lose one more insect-eating bat, we become just that much more dependent upon insecticides to control pests. And today we're using about 1 billion pounds of pesticides annually in the United States. 33 million pounds of those are neurotoxins that attack our brains, not just insect brains. And now there's actually a huge body of scientific data showing that these pesticides are contributing greatly to everything from cancer to dementia. And every time we carelessly lose some more bats, we're just ensuring more dependence on something that's already making us sick and could really wreak havoc in the long-term future.
Jade says, that's great. Thank you for your time, information, hard work, and have a good evening. Thanks, Jade.
I think unless somebody has another question,
we've got a pressing question that would really, really appreciate a quick answer about coronavirus. And we have another comment about vampire bats.
I'll be happy to talk briefly about coronavirus. It's certainly been a hot topic the last few days, occupied a hell of a lot of my time.
So the question is it correct to say that a mammal cannot be a reservoir for rabies because mammal...
Wait a minute, are we talking coronavirus or rabies?
Well, she said this is bothering her because of the recent coronavirus article that came out yesterday.
Okay,
so
let me just divide these into two answers because coronaviruses have nothing to do with rabies.
Okay.
First, we'll deal with rabies.
Okay.
Rabies has been a hugely exaggerated problem when it comes to being associated with bats. This goes way back when I first got involved in conserving bats. When I first founded Bat Conservation International years ago, I was thought to be absolutely stupendously crazy for giving up a good full-time research job to go out and try to save bats when everybody knew that bats were mostly, if not all, rabid, and Americans were spending millions of dollars a year to have them poisoned in their homes. Well, let's put the rabies situation in perspective. Bats are the source of almost 100% of human rabies cases in America today. But look at the other side of the coin. There are only 1 to 2 cases annually in the United States and Canada combined, making it an incredibly rare source of disease and one that you can easily avoid if you simply don't go around picking up sick animals. And if you're foolish enough to pick up a sick animal and you get bit, go to the doctor. And there's still an opportunity to get vaccinated and protected in time. So rabies shouldn't be much of an issue when it comes to bats. Now, where does rabies really come from? Worldwide, more than 55, close to 60,000 humans die annually of rabies, 99% from dogs. And this whole batch of scare stories that's come out in the last few days and weeks about bats in Brazil is absolutely ridiculous when it comes to misrepresenting the true importance of rabies, even in Brazil. These stories talk about 40 people having been bitten in a single large area of Brazil in a few-month period, one of whom died of rabies. I guarantee you that in that same period and same size area, that far more people than that died of riding bicycles or died of being attacked by vicious dogs. These things are taken way out of proportion, and if they would just be put in perspective, we wouldn't be so worried about bats. Truthfully, 99% of all rabies in the world comes from dogs. Now,
so the question is reservoir a correct term?
Bats are a reservoir for rabies, but most mammals can be reservoirs for rabies. That just means that they can have rabies, and actually reservoir means you can have and not get sick, but many carnivores, skunks, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, there are actually strains of rabies unique to American dogs versus Asian dogs. There are many different types of rabies in different types of animals, but virtually all mammals can contract rabies, And bats are one of the ones that do harbor rabies, but we don't have to worry about them harboring rabies if we just leave them alone. Right here in Austin, 30 years ago, health officials proclaimed hundreds of thousands of bats moving into our downtown bridge to be really dangerous, mostly rabid, going to attack people. And yet all we had to do was put up some small signs warning people not to try to handle the bats. And in more than 35 years since, we haven't had a single person harmed by a bat in Austin. Now, if you want something about the coronavirus stories that have been going the last week or so, again, these are a major, out of proportion, most, not all of them, but most of the stories are way out of proportion, sensationalized. It is true that many coronaviruses can be found in bats. It's also true that most of the world's viruses have yet to be discovered, and we can find viruses wherever we want to look. We could find probably more than one new species of virus that's never yet been discovered right now by just looking at our own belly buttons.
So I think it's still a little unclear. Do they harbor rabies and not get sick?
Not generally. Usually a bat, once it could be infective, it dies. Bats tend to get a paralytic rabies, so they don't go around attacking people when they're rabid. It's so rare to be attacked by a rabid bat that in my whole career of 50-some years studying bats worldwide, sometimes surrounded by millions at a time in caves, I have yet to ever see an aggressive bat. I have yet to be attacked. Nobody of the millions of people that come to Austin to watch bats has ever been attacked. It's incredibly rare. Yes, bats can be a reservoir just like dogs and many other things can be.
She says, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you. We're going to do another topic, another video, and we can talk all about disease. I don't want to stray too much from this, and we have a couple other comments and questions that before we're going to finish in a few minutes.
Okay, let's get to the other questions. We will, if you look at our recent blogs and bat flashes, you will see a lot of what I have to say about these recent stories that have been very sensationalized needlessly about coronaviruses.
Yeah, we're going to post one about coronavirus very soon, probably this week, and I linked a couple of the others in the comments.
In fact, back to what you're asking about rabies, we have a very informative resource. Look on our resource page.
It's in the comments.
About rabies, and you'll find a lengthy discussion of the latest information on rabies in America and worldwide.
Shireen is the one that did the article in Trinidad.
Oh, thank you, Shireen. You did a great job.
She said, we really appreciate the help you gave us in Trinidad. We are finally now, bats are finally now not listed as pests and vermin species.
Yay!
That's great. We've been working on that for decades. I don't know how many people have tried to get bats taken off the vermin list in Trinidad. I assume that a lot of this had to do with my wonderful colleague Jeffrey Gomes, who lives in Trinidad and has been a central figure in attempting to get that changed for a long time. I'm proud to have been of some small help to him.
She says, do you ever wish you could actually spend one night of your life as a bat?
I'd want to be a long ways away from people. They're too dangerous.
Carol Walters says, love your pictures and love your books. Thanks for all you do to educate people about bats. And
thank you, Carol.
Sue says, thank you for sharing your knowledge. Shireen says, yes, Jeffrey was a dedicated lobbyist. We'll do this. Any closing comments about caves? Maybe is there anything that, if you're just a caver, is there anything you can do on your next trip to help cave protection, or is there any kind of practical advice?
Well, one thing I definitely want to make clear is, once again, the caves we find bats in today aren't necessarily the best caves to protect for their future. We need to understand much more about their needs and what it takes to recognize the caves that they in the past depended on big time. And one of our best resources for doing that is what we call cavers, spelunkers. I'm very proud to report that actually next week I'll be the banquet speaker at the national meeting of the National Speleological Society, and I'll have a wonderful opportunity to meet countless cavers who have contributed greatly to bat conservation over the years and who have huge potential in the future.
Great. Let's see. Oh, Steph says, what continent would you want to research more?
What continent would I like to research more? Oh, they're all important. I can tell you a place that has been way too often neglected and has huge needs is Southeast Asia. When I went to Thailand close to 40 years ago, already the majority of caves I visited had lost all their bats, or almost all their bats. And you could still see the scaffolding left in place and poles on the floor where people had gone in and killed them to eat. One of my all-time favorite conservation stories about caves involves having gotten one of those sites protected. One of them that still had a fair number of bats had been losing its bats precipitously, and the monks that owned it had made their livelihood mining and selling guano for fertilizer. They asked my advice in what it would take to stop the decline. Luckily, within almost hours of being asked, while I was up photographing bats at night, I ran into the poachers who were putting big nets over the entrance, killing huge numbers of bats. And I was able to document what the problem was, convince the monks that if they'd just hire a game warden to protect the cave entrance at night when they weren't looking, that the cost of the game warden would be much more than repaid by the increased income from saving the. And when I came back 9 years later, their income had already risen from $12,500 US a year to $89,000, and a few years later it rose to $135,000. And as the bats began to really recover, they became so spectacular that you could see columns coming out for probably 2 miles around, and they now attract huge numbers of tourists. If you check for Khao Chong Prawn Cave in my blog section on my website, and you can find video and stills of those bats. Just having restored this one bat cave in one country has been worth probably close to $1 million a year, because not only are they now selling much more guano for fertilizer, but recent research has shown that the bats are saving local rice growers at least $300,000 a year in controlling white-bellied planthopper pests. And those are just one of a half a dozen pests the bats are actually consuming. So these numbers are very conservative. But just think what could happen all across Southeast Asia if we were to start restoring these. Literally, I mean, I've personally seen dozens of sites that once harbored huge colonies that have disappeared through people eating them all. In fact, my wife Paula and I, just a couple of years ago, visited a big cave in Cambodia, which during the reign of the Khmer Rouge, it wasn't protected, and people went in and ate most of the bats. But afterwards, a local village chief recognized that protecting the bats could be important. He started protecting the colony not that many years before our visit, and already his village was selling the guano for $50,000 a year for fertilizer. And that's not even considering how much they were probably making and avoided damage to crops. So there's huge potential in restoring some of these old bat caves, but there's potential almost everywhere. We just need to get better at recognizing the needs and doing something about them when we recognize them.
All right, so Carol has a question about wind turbines, which, Carol, I will link you to our resources on that subject, as we're just about out of time. And yeah, let's see. Can you read that? Joe says, did you talk to CDC and disease ecologists on your expedition? I assume he's asking about on Trinidad.
Hi, Joe. I have talked to people at CDC quite a bit about bats and various diseases, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we disagree. Let me point out that most of the worst scare stories that come out about bats, in fact, I've never seen one that didn't come out because of somebody trying to scare people because that was lucrative in grant getting. The biggest bat scares in American history have all been backed up by people looking for increased rabies budgets, pest control operators looking for more business. Nobody would scare you about bats if there wasn't a profit in it, but unfortunately there are billions of dollars of profit at stake, and that's something we'd probably have to talk about another time.
Okay. That was an hour, so I think...
Okay, I think our hour is up. I hope that all of you will visit our website. We've got a lot of good resources on there that will answer probably a large part of your questions. Thank you.